Good afternoon and welcome to Achates Live on Tuesday, the 11th of May, and to our session, Social Justice, You Are Not Alone. I'm Caroline McCormick and I'm the Director of Achates, the strategy and fundraising consultancy company I founded in 2014. Today, Achates is privileged to have a brilliant staff team of whom I couldn't be more proud. I'm fortunate to be able to work with hundreds of cultural organisations of all scales and art forms across the UK. We think that we're lucky in that our success comes from our approach, which is summed up in our name, Achates. He was a loyal advisor and friend to Aeneas, who was valued because he told the truth. So truth to power has always been our approach. And today I am thrilled to welcome two very special guests who've been generous enough to join me in trying to do just that. Firstly, welcome to Rowena Dean, Head of Development at National Museums Liverpool. Hello, Rowena.
Hello.
Lovely to have you with us. And secondly, a familiar guest to some of you, our friend Suzanne Lane, who's a cultural thinker. Hello, Suzanne. Lovely to have you with us again.
Hello.
This event is broadcast live and then available on YouTube, so all information is correct at the point of broadcast, but may then change. I don't need to tell you all that the last year has been extraordinary, with COVID bringing into sharp relief issues that we were all living with, but may not have perceived so plainly before. Issues of social justice, from Black Lives Matter to women's rights. Issues of environmental justice, the sharp disparities in wealth which underpin so many of the challenges in our society have been brought to the fore, and the fight for art and culture at a time when we see the implications of making a solely economic value argument on freelancers and the arm's length principle being dissolved as culture is made into a battleground for national identity. All of the people I know and work with in the cultural sector believe that art can play a key role in creating a kinder, fairer, what I would call a more philanthropic society. And yet, as a result of too many of our own practices and approaches not yet being equal, I'm not sure that we have yet achieved the place where we have the authority to create that society or to suggest it to others. And our impact is reduced. And too often, I fear, we are alone and disconnected and not sure where we can come together to try and bring about change. Achates Live was, of course, already in existence prior to COVID-19 as a monthly live event which took place at the Old Vic. But the switch to virtual during the pandemic has enabled us to reach a far wider and a new group of individual participants, and I hope provided some sense of community and continuity at a time when that sense has been critical to us all. But I would be the first to acknowledge that the influence we at Achates can lever is only as valuable as the voices we raise up. So today, we're honoured to have two very special guests with us who have agreed to share their experiences of the last year and their insights and ideas as to what is needed as we go forward. But I want to say that it's also your voices which will be really key to this conversation today. So perhaps more than in any other Achates Live session, I really would like to ask you to share your thoughts, your reflections and your ideas, as well as any questions you may have. We'd really like to try and make this into a conversation. So it's going to be a bit of a different Achates Live in that it will be a conversation initially between the three of us about these issues, and then hopefully a wider conversation between us all. We'll be in conversation for about half an hour, and then we will open up, as I've said. So that just leaves me to formally introduce our two panelists with me today, two remarkable women I like and admire very much, and I'm grateful to for joining us. And so before I ask them to talk a little about their experiences and insights from the last year and how they're looking forwards, I'd like to first of all introduce Rowena Dean. Rowena leads National Museum Liverpool's development department. This ranges from major capital appeals to visitor donation boxes. Before joining NML, Rowena was head of development at Liverpool Everyman and Playhouse, where she led the fundraising for the 28 million redevelopment of the Everyman Theatre. And glorious it is too, Rowena. Rowena sits on the board of the Wirral Chamber of Commerce Visitor Economy Network and is mentor for the Girls Network. And then I'd like to also introduce and welcome Susanna Lane. Suzanne is a cultural thinker and heads up a cultural consultancy which combines strategic thinking across brand and change management with a cultural incubator. Her current work focuses on leadership, power, difference, well-being and society. Welcome to you both. So, Rowena, can I ask you first, and then Suzanne, if you wouldn't mind, to set the frame for us by talking through your experience of these issues over the last year and perhaps to outline where you are now, a year into the pandemic. Rowena.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks for organising today as well. I think it's such an important conversation for us to all have. Yeah, the past year, wow. I think my experience of the past year, actually, as strange as it may sound, started before COVID hit. Because really, what I've experienced in the past year and what I think others have as well is when what we know to be normal in society is removed. So our day-to-day lives, the rules that we all behave in that make us operate in this world, this society that we think we live in are removed. Everything is seen differently. We see society differently and we see ourselves differently. So for me, actually, the start of that experience happened before COVID, which was in moving jobs. You mentioned before, Caroline, I was at the Everyman and Playhouse. I was there for 10 years, which is a long time to be in a job because I absolutely loved it. And there I worked with colleagues that were very like-minded, shared values. I'm not saying theatre is absolutely perfect. We know, and particularly from recent years, that there's lots of difficulties and lots of challenges that we need to address within theatre. But on a day-to-day basis, the people that I would work with shared my values. And then I moved roles, and a colleague in a position of power very clearly demonstrated behaviours and attitudes that were so at odds with my own. And maybe I was a bit naive, but very shocked actually that these attitudes would be in another cultural organisation. So to give you an example, and it's not, I don't love repeating these things, but all women want to be pursued by men, otherwise there would be no babies, just to give it a taste of that. But anyway, what that threw up for me was, it was that removal of my understanding of the world that I operated in, that this was a real attitude and it was right in front of me. And with that, within a team of, my team is mostly women, there's 13 of us, mostly brilliant women, a lot of them young women, but it's simply not acceptable. And there was a responsibility on me there to ensure that they weren't put in situations that they shouldn't be. So it was challenged and we came to an outcome that suited everyone. But when we came into COVID, I felt that there was parallels with that removal of what I knew to be true, entering into this new world. And I mean, Caroline see me through some of this, but the major thing that I experienced going through COVID was I have 2 small children. When lockdown hit, they were 3 and 6. And I remember the announcement of schools were closing, and suddenly I was looking after a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old whilst working a very, very busy job. And, you know, I think most people in this virtual room are fundraisers, and what a time it's been for us as fundraisers over the past year. And I remember thinking, this can't happen. Yet it did. I thought someone would step in. I thought that our society knew that it was not okay to place people under that strain. Yes, it did. We carried on with Black Lives Matter movement, which was particularly felt in my place of work that runs the International Slavery Museum. Indeed, we're trying to make significant changes to our organisation. So professionally, but also personally, again, educating and understanding what I was hearing at that time. And then the horrific case of Sarah Everard hit. And I think as women, it made us all, so many people recognised that, but I saw members of my team struggle with that, and it being very difficult in a COVID environment to be, many of them, on their own, and trying to cope with this constant news and these feelings that they were having, and also understanding that there's a role that we need to play here as a manager and also in fundraising. So I suppose where I am now after a year of that is kind of recovering, I suppose, but nowhere near processing, not really having processed everything, but also trying to find a way forward for myself, for my family, for my team, for my organisation.
Thank you, Rowena. It's incredibly generous and incredibly brave to speak with such truth. And I notice you're using the language of the stages of grief there. And I think it's something really remarkable to be collectively, as a nation, even globally, to be going through those processes together. But I hear so little articulation of it. So thank you for your openness. Suzanne, may I turn to you?
Thank you. So for those that don't know me, I'm a cultural thinker. That means that I kind of look at society's big questions and try and answer them through research and working with arts and sometimes the commercial sector. And I think the pandemic for me has been a tale of twisted lovers. So on the one hand, some of the work I've done, I've never been so popular, and I'll talk more about that. But it has, without doubt, been the most difficult experience. And I want to share some personal stuff that I'm quite open about, and then sort of take you through that journey. So I'm 55, Black, female, menopausal, have PTSD, dyslexia, dissociative disorder, and a few other things. And I think the biggest thing that I would want to share with you is that the pandemic has simply amplified my life's experiences, both in and out of the workplace. And I want to pick up on some things that Caroline has talked about and Rowena in terms of my experience, which is this idea of truth to power. And when you can speak that truth to power and when you feel that you can't. And I've heard that analogy that, you know, we're all at sea and some of us are in yachts and some are in dinghies and some are actually in the sea fighting for their life. And for me, this pandemic has been really difficult because on the one hand, I have this saying, every time someone says something, I almost roll my eyes and go, welcome to my world. This has been my world in the funded sector. That feeling like all the rules have changed and you can't make them work for you. As a Black woman who believes in an equitable space, I just have never found those rules have worked for us. For many of us, that sudden realization that the political landscape, this idea of what is being done to the funded sector, that's always been my experience of trying to lead generally in the sector. And so on the one hand, for me, this has been really painful, and that word triggering, and layer upon layer. But on the other hand, I have been able to talk more freely and to use examples where other people and groups have come and said, this is how I feel. And I've been like, that feeling that we've never been able to explain to you. And I think that isn't just about a Black or a brown experience. I think absolutely that crosses the intersectionality of gender. It really hits true for those of us that would call ourselves disabled. And there's big differences between whether that is something that is a visual disability or in my case, a hidden disability. Unlike Rowena, I live on my own. And I think the thing that I have learned is, you know, some of my friends with young kids, I don't really talk about the challenges of living on my own because they're just like, swap. Just what, you know, it's that idea that all of a sudden you're building an office in the hall. Or, you know, for me, you've got all of these layers of challenges on top of your personal layers. I think the single thing that's come out that has been a little more brilliant is the idea of working from home if you choose. But I don't want to do down the men out there, and there are plenty of my friends and men that I know who have taken equal responsibility. But I am hearing so many stories of women who are literally trying to lead teams with a 3-year-old at their feet. And it seems that all of a sudden now we're doing back-to-back Zooms. You don't even have that time to think. So I think how I'd wrap up my experience is a lot of my hidden experiences have come out. I feel, and I'm quite loud and proud about it, that those of us who are marginalised have had to build this resilience for our entire career. And we have a lot to share, but would also caution, I suppose, for myself, this idea of resilience, because it is that thing of just keeping going whether you've got 2 kids and you're doing back-to-back Zooms, keeping going whether you're trying to lead a team, or just keeping going if you've just had a hard time. So I think that's probably my summary of my experience. And what would success look like? It would be having those hidden conversations out loud.
Thank you, Suzanne. And that is, of course, why I'm so grateful to you for taking that hidden conversation absolutely into the public domain today. And I think that idea of how thin the illusion of social justice is and how really near the surface that has always been is so clear. Moving on to myself, there is so much I want to say and so many things that you've both said that I want to respond to. During the pandemic, a foundation of a director who I've known for more than 25 years since my first job in the cultural sector stood down. And so I wrote to that person and I said, when I first came into the cultural sector and I was the only Northerner and everybody doffed their flat caps to me and spoke to me in a comedy accent, you made me feel as if I was in the right place. So thank you. And she wrote back to me and said, you were always in the right place, Caroline, use it well. And that was really powerful for me. And so I guess I've spent a lot of the last year thinking about leadership and really trying to think about what leadership is in the cultural sector. Because I think too much in the cultural sector, leadership is about being the head of an organisation. And for me, that really isn't what leadership is about. And so I've thought a lot about what it is to be a leader for Achates and to have the responsibility of a team. And I acknowledge that we made 2 team members redundant, and that was extremely difficult. And I spent most of the pandemic with a sign about this high on my desk that just said the word team in big letters on it, because I just felt that was my responsibility. And after about 6 months, I changed that sign to another one that said, don't f it up now. And I guess what I've tried to do in this period is to reach out, to create a platform through Achates Live, through donating pro bono time. All the team have been incredible in that regard. And through the foundation, the prize and the conference, really to strive to raise voices up. And I wouldn't say that we've succeeded, but we have tried to be supportive of our community whilst ensuring the company survives. And I'll be honest and say I'm really tired, like everybody is, but I am tired with the privilege of having a very wonderful husband, no children, and a very comfortable life. So fundamentally, I'm fortunate, and I hope I have the wit to know that that experience must be very different for other people. I think what really troubles me now is the sense of isolation. I speak to so many people every day who've undergone, from their very personal perspectives, different forms of trauma in this period, and they have nowhere to articulate it and share it. And there is, as I think you've both articulated, this very strong sense of just carry on. You know, we must just carry on and get on with it. And people feel disconnected, unheard, and alone. And as Suzanne has so clearly expressed, I don't think that's just about the pandemic. It's just that the pandemic has exposed those issues and exacerbated them. So for me, I suppose at a time when the culture of individualism has led us to believe that we are fundamentally alone and without meaning, the cultural sector has always stood in resistance to that. But its failings of inclusion and equality have really limited its impact, and the increasing forces of competition in the sector, for me, have really let down a sense of ecosystem which did used to exist, which can bring collective change. For me, not since the time of Thatcher have we seen a government which has had so little respect for the independence of thought that underpins the arm's length principle. But worse, because we're now more fractured as a sector and often passive and just simply responsive to cultural policy, that we're not perhaps challenging that in the way that we would have done in the past. So those are the things that I would like to think about and challenge. And I think we've set out a fairly broad stall for ourselves. I'm going to take us through a few thoughts that I've picked up from our conversation so far, but please, those of you in our wider community, do feel able to share your thoughts, comments, and ideas as well. Rowena, I think you've already partly answered this, but I'd love to hear you expand on it a bit further before I come to Suzanne. Are we as well equipped as we thought to deal with the challenges in our daily lives?
No, I don't think it is absolutely my experience. And I know I understood it a bit better, actually, Suzanne, when we spoke a couple of weeks ago. And I think I maybe would have described myself as naive, perhaps, going into the pandemic, of how I understood society. I would have described myself as absolutely resilient. I still would. I don't know whether that's necessarily a good thing. But I wasn't equipped to deal with a lot of what happened in the past. I don't think many people were, really. And I think it's equipped in lots of ways. It's not necessarily the getting on and doing it and carrying on, which has not been a choice, to be honest. It's been, you know, it's had to happen. I've got to look after my children. I've had to carry on with my job. But I don't think that I had the experience to be able to understand it, because I have a nice life, you know. I have a really brilliant husband who's been really brilliant through the pandemic. I work in arts and culture, which is absolutely the place where I want to be, where I'm often with very like-minded people. And I think before COVID hit, there was a lot that I just didn't see and hadn't experienced to be able to deal with this. So in some ways, I mean, not to be completely Pollyanna about it, because I think that we've got a lot of work to do, but at least our eyes are opened now. It's you don't know what you don't know, but now I think that a lot of us do know what we didn't know, but we don't know how to deal with that.
Thank you, Rowena. Suzanne, are we equipped, or are we as well equipped as we thought we were, from your perspective?
You know, when you asked that question, I wrote down, it depends on who you are and what you want. Because I think that for some people, this has been difficult, but I don't think it's exposed inequalities, because that's not their life and that's not what they want to see.
Yeah.
I think for other people who are more self-reflexive, it has exposed the fact that inequalities means that we're not equipped. And then for others who I think have always had to be piecing things together, they were equipped emotionally for almost the trauma of it, but not equipped with some of the day-to-day practicalities. So I really do think, for me, the first year, I I was probably more equipped than others, emotionally, in terms of things that I've been through, things that I've seen, my expectation, my own engagement with government broadly, not about a political belief. I think the real question for me is, are we in a position where we want to make change, and are we equipped to do that?
Thank you, Suzanne. And I think from my perspective, I think the illusion of busyness, which is so prevalent in the cultural sector, dashing from one event to the next and feeling important because you're busy, is definitely something I'm guilty of, I think. I think that's something that I'm reflecting on a great deal and trying to consider, how will I use my time better? Not that won't be just about what I attend as an event, but actually where I put my energies, I think. And yeah, trying to use those in a constructive way. But yeah, I definitely feel that many of my resilience tactics have been the ones I've lent on, things like space for a bit of exercise, space for reading, but at the same time, other things have become very clear they're fairly fragile, absolutely. Suzanne, I'd like to go back to something you were talking about there, if I may. And it does seem to me that many of the social justice movements have got techniques, approaches, methodologies that actually we're just beginning to look to and learn from. Do you think that's right?
I think it's spot on. I think, well, first of all, I think yes, but I think it's possibly even deeper than that. Movements are made of people. And I think actually it's the individuals that have had to find a way to navigate work, society, that doesn't see what's happening to them. And though the set of skills you have to build to navigate that are extraordinary, and are the set of skills that I think many other people are realizing. It's what we used to call soft skills in a different way, but just for me, being able to navigate in all white spaces where people have felt that they were open. Was inaugural co-chair for What Next, and I don't think they'll mind me saying that when I joined the steering committee 2 years ago, they were adamant that they were an open organisation. 2 years on, there's a much greater understanding of what that means. And I think a lot of that has been about listening to voices who have been listened to before, but have had to make their way.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think that gives us quite a lot of food for thought. I mean, Rowena, from your perspective, do you think there are things there that you will try and apply in your own team and work?
Yeah, I think absolutely, Suzanne. I think you just articulated something really important there as well about the about power and not listening, and I think that's something that a lot of us are just realizing or experiencing, and you speak about it very eloquently, but I've absolutely found that is something across the past year that I experienced for the first time. In that, where was the combined voice of people that were really struggling? It wasn't there. It didn't exist. It hadn't been built. It still hasn't. So I think that was really difficult. So I think in terms of day-to-day practice and taking things forward with my team, but I think I don't have all the answers right now, but I think there's definitely something with myself and my team of understanding each other and understanding what's happening to everybody, and understanding that what you may think is privilege to someone isn't necessarily.
Yeah, and it takes time to do that, and to listen well, doesn't it? And I think that's the thing I'm really nervous of, I'll be honest and say, is going back to being so busy that it's hard to listen well and to take the time to do that. So I think it's a good check for myself, I know. And I'd like to sort of segue there to the idea of leadership, which I was talking a little bit about. I do think that leadership and senior management have somehow got confused in the cultural sector. You know, so much of the leadership training is about how to be the head of organization. And it's something that I'm really keen to sort of redefine as something we can all hold. You know, I think that a culture where everyone can display leadership at all levels means embracing a degree of discomfort and challenge to ideas. And I'm not sure that despite our liberal values, we're very good at doing that at the minute. There is a free speech question in some regards. There is a consensus sort of a view that you will go along with. Suzanne, what does leadership look like and how does it behave?
I think this idea you've brought up already of leadership and senior management and what the difference might be. I think leadership requires an element of bravery and listening at the same time. I actually think in this age, so I do quite a lot of change programs where I go in and I work with senior leaders to ask that question of themselves in terms of getting their organization from A to B. And I think one of the key areas that leaders don't think about is that area of listening and discomfort and not always being right. And that collaborative element, whilst you may be making the ultimate decision and you're steering the ship or the tanker or the dinghy, whatever size it is. And we know that, you know, tankers take longer to turn and make change. But that idea of sitting with discomfort and not always being right and not ceding to your power, that allows you to shut down conversation. So for me, I think outside of how we would generally talk about leadership, I think for me today, it's about those very specific elements that really make leaders and being able to step into other people's shoes and not just hear, but feel and take that time.
It's really funny you express it like that, because the word that's coming into my mind, Suzanne, is empathy. And for me, that's fundamentally the condition of philanthropy. So yeah, I have to say that resonates beautifully with me. Rowena, for you, it must be, oh, sorry, Suzanne.
I just jump in if you've brought up empathy. So people will know I'm doing this research on where power resides in the brain. And one of the biggest areas of research at the moment is the relationship between power and empathy. And I think it's really difficult for leaders who've reached a certain level, because what research is showing, not always, is that as your power goes up, your empathy levels might come down, not always. And that seems crucial in this moment, just to think about that.
Suzanne, I think that's a whole nother session, which I can barely wait for. It's brilliant as ever. Rowena, you, as you've mentioned, have got a really lovely team of particularly women of all ages and levels of experience. It must be something you're thinking about a great deal in terms of leadership and how that works and how you can cultivate that in your team as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got an absolutely brilliant team and really fantastic women that are really powerful, and it's nothing to do with their position, nothing to do with them being an officer or a manager. They're really powerful because of who they are. And I think that's really one of the reasons why I brought up that point when I started about the challenge when you see something inappropriate happening, because I think when you've got a team of really brilliant women, actually it can be something happening to you, but it's easier to do things on behalf of other people. And partly because it's easier just not to act on your behalf, but also there is a responsibility there of young women to see how we behave. And I did worry about them at that time. I think that the strange thing that happened in that situation was I was their boss, but they were the support for me.
Brilliant. Yeah.
All absolutely brilliant people. But that issue of mistaking senior managers for leaders, I think I've definitely seen that and recognised it and come across it. And actually, when you're talking about those senior managers, you know, what they have responsibility. They have responsibility for an area of work. The leadership element of it is actually something I think is completely separate. And I think that what we confuse sometimes with senior managers is that power is the leadership, and they're separate things. And I think that what we see when we see some really remarkable leadership is that people that do really incredible things that actually haven't been given that power, they will go and they will move things forward. And I've seen that throughout my organisation. Actually, I've seen leadership in people that aren't senior managers or that aren't managers.
Just by their own truth and their own bravery, absolutely. I want to go to the issues of equality. I'd like to both touch on gender equality and in terms of racial and social justice more widely, but time is limited. How do we now start to turn our long conversation on these issues in the sector, perhaps into more of a lived reality? Because of course, Black Lives Matter, you know, everybody putting out their statements. Are we seeing that translated into change, or what do we need to do to try and get it to translate into real change? Suzanne, can I come to you first?
Let me just unmute myself. So I think, you know, I mentioned at the beginning, you know, some of the intersections I sit at, whether that's female, whether that's being Black, whether that's mental health, going through menopause. I think in terms of social justice and change, it is not just about bringing to the fore a better representation of society as leaders. It's about deciding as a sector what our values are. And then I think it's about deciding what does that mean in terms of change. So we've had a really interesting conversation about what does it mean to be an ally?
Yeah.
Is that someone who encourages you when the going gets tough, they kind of step back a bit because they don't want that risk to themselves. And I think we talked about this a little before we came on air, this idea that sometimes being a leader and making change or being supportive is terrifying because you could lose your own role and your own job. And I think my fear is that we're in such challenging times, both in terms of funding, politically, that I'm not seeing the change that I would like to see. And I think that's because individually people are committed, but individually putting your toe over the ledge or putting your head above the parapet, for many leaders, feels like, well, I may be the one to lose this venue, be the one not to get the next cultural recovery fund. Do you know what I mean? Those are very real fears. So I'm not overly optimistic, but I do see some glimmers of hope with some organisations and some individuals. But I fully accept how difficult it is.
I think that's a really generous way of putting it, because there's undoubtedly risk with any exercise of power or leadership. And as you say, I think there are people who are reaching out without doubt. I wonder if there is that question of that space where we can reduce the risk by coming together. And yeah, I'm not sure what those spaces are. Rowena, what are your thoughts in terms of addressing social justice? I mean, it's clear from what you've said that very difficult situation you encountered when you first took up your role has changed. And it sounds like the organisation has changed tremendously in that time. Are you hopeful that you can continue to push that process of change forward?
Yeah, I am. And I think, in that situation, the organisation responded well. And I think, we've been through a huge amount of change as an organisation in recent years. Anyway, I think the conversation we just had about leadership and about bravery, and what Suzanne just mentioned about putting your head above the parapet, I think that's very difficult for organisations to do. And I think that there are so many things out there stopping us, even for organisations who are absolutely committed to this, which then makes that change at different levels even more difficult. I am hopeful in that there's more listening. And I think that's something that we've seen across the past year, in that actually what we need to do is listen. I mean, I speak about this quite often in our work with the International Slavery Museum, and that we want to create change to the International Slavery Museum. I'm sorry, I'm going into the professional work here, but it's really important. And we don't have a national museum that is focused on the understanding and the study of transatlantic slavery and its legacies. But to do that, we cannot do that as an organisation that is predominantly white people. And we haven't made the changes that we've been told to make by Black communities that are telling us to do things. And I think that the realisation for us, which is very, very genuine and very, 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 very held by the organisation, is that we need to listen and we need to change with our community. So there's a huge amount to do, and we're an organisation that's committed to doing that, and it's difficult. To other organisations, I think it's even more challenging. We've seen a huge amount of marketing. I'm going to call them marketing and brand campaigns, actually, because there has been lots of that messaging across the past year. But look behind that and look at the actual organisations and look at their staff and look at their policies and what they're doing. And has there really been a huge amount of change?
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting. I mean, when the Sewell report, I was looking at your Twitter and seeing how you're managing that, and so carefully how you were managing that and handling that, and taking that very careful line in terms of campaigning versus actually as a charity communicating. And at a time when that kind of communication is under so much scrutiny, I think it is really challenging. It's that sense of conscience, isn't it? As you say, I think coming back to Suzanne's point about shared values and shared conscience, and then keeping to try and push and live those things and constantly reminding yourselves of it. And it's hard, I think, but it needs to be hard. Rowena, I'm going to go to the floor in just a moment, I should say, and just pick up some of the comments from the people who are in the chat. So, coming to you shortly. So keep your comments coming and your questions, please. So Rowena, there's one thing I really want to pick up with you specifically, if I may, but I think it really also pertains to a power question, which I'd love to just reflect with you, Suzanne. And that's really about fundraisers. And really just thinking about how fundraisers have perhaps never really been on the agenda in terms of safeguarding. And you and I have had conversations as professional fundraisers about situations that we've been put in over the years that perhaps we haven't felt were right or comfortable, and how often, particularly women as fundraisers, but not exclusively by any means, we can be treated as a commodity. And yeah, do you think that we will start as a sector to have a conversation about respect and safeguarding for fundraisers that perhaps we haven't had before?
I would love it if we did, because I absolutely don't think it's happening now. I'm a member of lots of different forums and groups of fundraisers. I've never seen the conversation happen. And we all have stories. I can guarantee that everybody in this virtual room will have some story. And there's a number of things wrong with us all having these stories. One of them also is that is a real misunderstanding of what fundraising is, to say that you will send somebody out. So one of the stories I've shared with you before, Caroline, is being in a board meeting, and well, this funder, he likes the ladies, send Rowena out for lunch with him. Turned out he was completely wrong about that funder. He was great. But that's not what fundraising is about. I'll borrow your words, Caroline. It's an exchange of values.
Absolutely.
People want to see change and see good things. That you're not going to go and get money out of somebody by going and doing what someone may suggest you do. So I think that there's a real issue there, but we're not talking about it. And I've definitely been in situations where I've gone to people's homes, I've gone alone, not really put anything in place. I think that's slightly different now, but I absolutely do want to look for myself and for my team at what we put in place and how we actually address this. And to be honest, I run the department, so I am in a position where I've got the power to be able to do that. So that's absolutely something in my gift to do, and I'm sure my organisation would support me. But I think in terms of the sector, we do need to have these conversations. So I think fantastic that we're at least here today talking about it.
Yeah, and if there's people on the chat who want to share anything in that regard, I'd be really keen to hear it. I've told Rowena and Suzanne about an experience when I was at the Natural History Museum and I was working on the Darwin Centre campaign. I was sent to Canada to meet this chap who's fanatical about Darwin, and I knew that he had a collection of Times newspapers from every day that Darwin was alive in his basement. And I texted my team and said, if I'm not out in 5 minutes, call the police, as I went down into his basement, and just thinking there is no protection here at all. And I laugh now. Suzanne, it's a power question. Are we thinking about power in our institutions in a meaningful way yet?
So I've got power in institutions. I've got a bigger question actually is, do any of us really think about power and how it implicates every sentence in every day of our lives? I don't think we do, which is why I'm doing the research. And I think it's a very difficult thing. I think this country, like many, is predicated on power. There's actually, and so that when that conversation, I feel, is one of those things that are hidden. But actually, for many communities in many countries, they define power differently. So I think, first of all, you have to ask what is power, and then ask what conversations are you having in organizations? Because you have to come to an agreement of what power means. And quite often, troubling for me, to get more power, it's power over people.
Yes.
Whereas for the Indigenous communities and for the Yoruba communities, they define power completely differently, and power cannot be absorbed by yourself. It has to be shared with others.
Yeah.
That whole idea of what it is and how you use it. So very simply put, I don't think power is talked about in organisations, and we've embedded it as part of a change programme, but also to hold that space kindly, because it's one thing asking if power is talked about in organisations, it's another thing to be able to do that nicely and well, because
otherwise. Yeah, absolutely. Lovely couple of thoughts coming up from the floor here. Sanpreet says that I think that over the last year, we've often heard from mid to senior level professionals whose home lives can be really different to early career professionals. If you're more likely to either live with your partner or your family rather than a house or a flat share, it could be really difficult to find your own space to work. I don't think this has been addressed and can be overlooked. And she says, I'm typing this as my housemate who's been on furlough over the year plays really loud music in the room below. Sanpreet, absolutely. And I think that's really, really fair. And again, it's about who has voice and who has control of the conversation. Absolutely. I will also counter that and say there was a moment in the first sort of 6 months of a pandemic where it felt like all the stories in the newspapers about having nothing to do when you're on furlough. And at the same time, I was just every day talking to leaders who were just crumbling because they were doing several people's work. And that imbalance between wealth and was also then being mirrored in the imbalance in work. And it was a few people being very busy and a few people being absolutely, other people being absolutely not. Sanpreet also asks, and I'd love to put this to both of you, what do you do when, like this morning, theatres announce that they will be directed by people who've been vocally anti-Me Too and dismissive of Black Lives Matter? Suzanne, can I come to you first on that?
I think it depends who you are. I'm really lucky to have a coach or several coaches, and we were doing some work on where you would work or who you would work for, you wouldn't work for. And sometimes I think self-preservation is key. And I think that if this is about employment, I think you really have to consider who you engage with.
Yeah.
Before you even get there. And if it's about public spaces and access, and then I think it's about where you choose to put your money. But that's such a good question because it sums up our entire conversation about how do we collectively talk about values and what we believe to be right.
Absolutely, thank you. Rowena, what's your thoughts?
What a difficult situation. I think it does depend on who you are, and I think sometimes one of the things that happens to us is that you enter situations that you wouldn't have believed would happen in the place of your work, your industry, and you have to weigh it up for yourself, what your options are with that, and make your own choices. And sometimes it can be very difficult because it can come down to your own risk and your own employment, how much you say, how much you stick your head above that parapet, but also how at odds is that with your values? How detrimental to you is it going to be if you carry on in a situation which is going to be really, really unhealthy?
Absolutely. I think that's so well expressed. And I guess what I really want to do is thank our two panelists today, Suzanne and Rowena, for being generous and insightful and brave and good leaders. And sometimes it's just conversations that you have with people that you think, I wish other people could hear this conversation. So I'm really grateful to you both today to allowing us to share our conversations more widely. And I hope that they have been something of a point of inspiration or possibly provocation for you. It's no coincidence to me that I felt very strongly that it was time to have another conversation like this 6 months after the Achates Foundation had our conference, at which Suzanne spoke so brilliantly. And yeah, I'd really welcome thoughts that anybody would like to send me after the session today about what they think we should be doing next. So I think that really now it's just my job to say thank you to you both. Really generous of you. And I want to also just mention that our next session will be on Tuesday, the 8th of June, and it's going to be focused on legacies. Perhaps a different kind of difficult topic, one that we all find difficult to talk about. But we've got some really insightful panelists who are both moving into legacy fundraising for the first time, or are coming from a position of really deep knowledge and experience, or indeed transferring some of that knowledge into the cultural sector for the first time. So take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. And thank you again, Rowena and Suzanne, and to all of you for being with us today. Goodbye.